Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park, and we are on our last read of A Tiny Upward Shelf with Melissa Chadburn. And today I kind of wanted to discuss using foreign language in books and something that Melissa does really well, which is integrating it into the story rather than defining every last bit.
Yeah.
Now, the reason this topic came to mind was this is my time to pick the next book. And so as I was searching and I was trying to do a little bit of research on what book I wanted to go through next, I was reading reviews for certain books and people kept complaining about other books saying like, oh, they use different foreign language and they don't say what it is and I'm only going to give them 1 star for that. And I was like, yeah, like what's the point of reading a foreign novel if you're not trying to integrate yourself into that environment?
Right. I feel like that's so messed up to give 1 star just because preference-wise they didn't integrate or include an English definition next to it.
Right. And I mean, the whole point of having those words in the story is so that it emphasizes certain points or it brings out kind of a trueness to the character.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you go and say mahal and that means love, it's like that's so stupid. It takes you out of the moment of what the story is trying to say.
Right. It messes with the pacing. It takes you out of the moment. And it's not natural to the character anymore.
Right.
The character isn't going to define these things for themselves, so it doesn't make sense for it to be included in the story. And on top of that, that becomes English supremacy.
Right. And it's, again, one of those things where it's, why are we always having to teach rather than someone going to look up these things? Like, if you're trying to get into the story, imagine that you're reading a book that you didn't know the definition to. What would you do? You'd look it up.
Right, you'd either look it up or look at the context clues and then just keep going.
Right. And I don't think it's surprising that when I do look at the profiles of these people, because that's the direction that my brain goes in, it is very familiar. It's always someone who's white.
Yes.
It never is someone who's of color, and usually if there's a secondary comment section where you can comment on the comment, it's people defending the choice to use those words and use the foreign language within there.
Absolutely.
I, at first, was definitely more confused by the beginning of the story with the utilization of some of the words I didn't know. But luckily, I know a couple of Tagalog words, so
there's that.
I kind of was able to use some of that within the story. But the other thing that Melissa does really well is use context clues.
Yes.
So I never really felt like I needed to look something up. I felt like it all made sense within the story and I can get a sense of what that word meant.
Right. Even
without having to Google search it or translate it.
Right, or sometimes you ask a certain person who also knows Tagalog words.
Right, you're right. But anyways, that was my little gripe as I was researching for the next book.
Totally. And can I add that people are not going to make that same comment about not having translation when it's French words or when it's Italian words. Right. They're going to look it up or they already know it.
Right.
Why? Because they're constantly reading things with those same words. And if they just did that for other languages, maybe they wouldn't have such gripes.
Yeah, so, if you have your own defense against why you don't like the use of the foreign language in books, definitely I'd be curious as to what it is, because I don't like just to think that there's only one way to do it. But I think you and I both feel the same way about it.
Yes.
And I think you and I would probably feel the same way about our recommendation for this week.
Our recommendation for this week is Zelina on Wheels. Their name is Zelina, and she's known on Instagram for posting videos of her skating and fashion choices. And what I appreciate about Zelina is that she doesn't only just post the tricks that she can do and that she nails, but she also posts the fails that she takes. So when she falls or if she is learning a new trick, she posts those very frequently, just as frequently as her really good videos where she's actually getting the trick. And what makes me appreciate that is that it makes me feel like I can do it too. I have been thinking about skating, even though I'm very clumsy, but with Zelina and Nicole Byer encouraging people and showing people that they can do it, I feel like I can do it too.
Yes, but we should buy a lot of pads and helmets.
Absolutely. If you don't already know and if you don't already remember, I'm clumsy as heck. You can see Zelina's work and support her work as well on Instagram at Zelina on Wheels.
That's spelled ZELINAONWHEELS. And that's our recommendation for the week. Okay, so this is our last read of A Tiny Upward Shove by Melissa Chatburn. What have we gotten to so far?
So far we've gotten into a lot. We've seen Mutya and Lola where they've been while Marina has been in the Pines. We also learned more about Alex's backstory and how she had an adoptive mother before she went back home. And then we also started seeing more of the Aswang again in the last read.
Right.
But before we get into that, a few content warnings. In this last read, there is mention and actual show of sexual abuse, child abuse, and mention of drug abuse.
Right. So, this book's still heavy.
Yes.
But we're in our very last read. And we're reading pages 257 to 334 on hardcover, which are chapters Redaction to Departure.
And now, going into this last read, we are focusing on the major topics. It still is jumping in terms of the timeline. And so let's start off with how there are new characters introduced in this last quarter.
Right. I mean, we're kind of wrapping everything up. We see where the story's going, and yet we get a lot of new characters.
Yes. And I kind of felt like, where in the world is this going? Because even by 30 pages out, there was a new character added into the story, and it kind of made me feel a little scared, and not by spooky scared, but afraid that we were ending on a cliffhanger.
Right. And the characters have relevance.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was also interesting that Melissa decided to put so much backstory to each character. It wasn't just that this was a new character, this was the sheriff in town, or this was a person in charge of this, or like it every character had something that we could attach the personality to.
Right, and like you said, there was purpose. For example, one of the new characters was Corin, and Corin was supposed to show like a soft side to Willie.
Right.
Kind of?
I mean, I don't know if you remember the part where Corinne and Willie are hanging out, and all of a sudden Willie asks Corinne to kiss him.
Yeah.
That like nearly made me vomit. I was so disgusted.
I was revulsed as well, but it did show that he had feelings for this person, and that it was less of a I'm gonna take over and more of a can you kiss me?
Yeah, I mean, it was the one time he asked for permission.
Consent.
But it was like the way that Corinne described it.
Yeah.
It was very disgusting. Like the smells, the taste of it.
Oh.
It was so nasty. Another character that we were introduced to was Constable Sherman, who ended up being the arresting officer for Willie. You know, we'll get to that part as we get to it.
A little later, yes.
But there was a chapter dedicated to him, just talking about his background a little bit.
And his intentions for being a sheriff, or not a sheriff, but a constable.
Right.
In that he wasn't just out there trying to arrest people. He was out there trying to help. He wanted to get to know who these people on the streets were.
Right.
And trying to find ways to bring resources to them, even if it was on his own time.
Right. Speaking of words that I don't know that are foreign, what is a constable?
I think a constable is an officer. That's what it sounded like to me. I didn't look it up. Instead, what I did was see the context clues, because it seemed like the other constables were more focused on arresting than they were about helping.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. But we also get introduced to Jan and Josie.
And Josie's daughter, Sasha.
Right. So these characters, well, mainly one of them,
Josie,
ends up being a very big part of this ending.
Yes.
Which we'll get to, because let's talk about the different endings for all the different characters.
Definitely. And with these endings, we do start to see the loose ends tied up.
Right.
First is Mutya and how she never showed up for Marina. She didn't show up when Marina was getting emancipated in court.
Right.
And that was her failing and her just giving up and trying to be a godly woman without being a parent.
So, yeah, one of the reasons why Mutya, I think, doesn't show up is because she didn't do any of the parenting classes.
Right.
Like, she stopped going to all these things.
Right.
But the sad part is, throughout this book, we see several instances that I think could have possibly changed the trajectory of Marina's path.
Right.
And I think Mutya had several different points where she could have affected her life.
Right.
This was definitely one of the biggest ones, in my opinion, was Marina just kept looking and hoping that Mutya would be there.
Right.
There was even that scene where she was on the bus with who she called the gerbil boy.
Yeah, the little kid that was there first.
Right, and she kept talking about that little kid like he was a little child. Like, he was so gleeful and excited to see his mom. And she was like, oh, that's stupid. Don't be happy about that.
Right.
But in the end, when Mutya didn't end up showing up to the trial, that was where Marina felt just like that little kid. She realized that she actually had all these hopes and aspiration of Mutya actually showing up.
Right.
There's a quote from the book where she actually says, she realized then she had felt as much enthusiasm fill her heart as the little gerbil boy in the country van, only to deflate. So, I don't know, it was very sad the way that Mutya's story had so many times appeared throughout this book and how it affected Marina.
Right.
But I also felt like the chapter that Melissa had put in at the very end with describing Mutya's story,
Right.
I thought that was kind of necessary.
It definitely needed to be said, and it definitely helped to close the chapter on Mutya.
Right.
And make us feel as though, well, I guess that's it for her.
Kind of. I mean, for me, it did a little bit more than that.
Okay.
So we always see the perspective through which the author wants us to see, right? So we see Marina's perspective, and we see her home alone. We see her feeling lonely. And so the vibe and the mood is very sad, desperate, looking for love.
Yeah.
But when Mutya finally gets that chapter to explain herself, it sounds very adult in some of the decisions that she's making. It doesn't mean that she was a successful parent by any means, but it shows the reasoning behind her leaving Marina alone.
That's fair.
Because for me, I was always like, okay, so she's a really bad mother. Like, she doesn't care about Marina. She has no... Like, why does she even want Marina around? Like, why not just send her to Lola? But then we find out Mutya actually really loved Marina. She just didn't want her to see that side. She didn't want Marina to see her with her boyfriends. And then that day that she ended up going to Sam's place, she was sad that Marina had begged so many times. And so that was the reason she actually decided to let her go. And I thought it humanized the experience of who Mutya was rather than just seeing her as a bad parent.
Fair. That's fair.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, like you said, I think it does tie the bow on her story. I still don't think she was a great mother. I mean, clearly there are a lot of things that she didn't do to actually help the life of Marina.
Or protect her
Right.
at all.
Right. But, once again, I think that was necessary.
Another ending that we already knew because it started at the very beginning of the story is that Marina died. But the Aswang, which is also what we know from the beginning of the story, finished her mission, which was what we found out towards the end of the book is that her mission was to find Sabina, who is Alex's adoptive mother.
Right. So before we even get there, there's a lot of story for Marina to fill. So Marina is starting off in this halfway house where she is now able to get emancipated. This is where we get to the scene where she's in the courthouse and Mutya doesn't show up. But then we see the whole story of Marina going through the path of what eventually leads to her becoming a sex worker. And I think one of the things that's so well done in this book is it really highlights the life of what homelessness could be
For young people.
Exactly. Like, for me, I still don't know what that is. Like, I haven't seen it through my own lens. I've only seen it around. I mean, we live in Portland, and Portland has a very big homeless population right now. I've also lived in LA, which has historically had a big homeless population. So I've always seen that aspect. But especially for, for my household, I don't know if this is a lot of Asian American stories, but for my story, what I was always told was, if you don't study hard or you don't work hard, you're gonna be a homeless person. You're gonna not have a place to live. Which, obviously, as I grew older, I was like, oh, that's very much not true. Like, that's not an actual thing that happens.
Right. It's not about how hard you work. It's really the systems, and the systems working against us.
And the circumstances. I mean, there's so many factors that come into play. And I think that's where Marina's story was so well told, is she wasn't a person that wasn't smart. She wasn't a person that didn't try. She just ended up in a spot where she didn't have any more options.
Right. She kept trying. She was very intelligent. Right. She had so much talent.
Right.
But circumstances and decisions that were made forced her into the foster home, and then forced her into the, not necessarily foster home, but it was like for the emancipated.
Right. It's not Section 8 housing, but it's like
a middle ground.
Right. It's somewhere where the housing is somewhat affordable and you can still live in.
It's subsidized housing.
There you go. Yeah, and even in that, we know that she's not earning money, but she wants to earn money, so she's trying to get a job, but the paychecks won't come through, or if they do, they get lost.
Right.
So she's like, I just want to go to, like, I forget, like, one of the printing or copier companies.
Cisco?
I don't know. And then go and make her resume, fax them out. Like, she wants to go through the process of finding a job, but she can't.
Right.
This also leads to another problem that then forms, which is her addiction.
And also, in order to feed that addiction, she starts pickpocketing, which she realizes she's good at.
Right. So then she meets this person who helps even more fuel her addiction. Yeah. She falls down this really bad rabbit hole. The other thing she does for money is then start to provide sexual services. And she mainly starts practicing that out of the Astoria, which is one of the motels that she is in, and eventually realizes that she can't end up fulfilling her mission of getting to Sabina by just doing that.
Right.
So then she has to kind of span out a little bit more.
Yeah.
There's another scene within this Marina story where she finds out that Alex has gone into a really bad car accident, and she ends up running around trying to find Alex, but she is high off of, I think it was heroin, and this is at the same time that the Rodney King riots are happening, so it really shows this massive amount of disorientation, confusion, and just her trying to navigate herself to this point where she's trying to succeed, but is really struggling to do so from everything that's currently happening.
Right. Just too many things, too many thoughts and outside influences that are making things difficult.
Right. And eventually we don't actually get to the point where she meets Willie.
No.
At least through this story. We get that through the italicized sections earlier on in the book. But we can make the assumption that she meets Willie because she has bought that train ticket that takes her all the way up to Vancouver. She's trying to navigate that space. And yeah, I mean, I think with her trying to make a little bit extra money, we eventually get to the scene where Marina meets Willie and then the whole thing happens.
Yes. In addition, another person that we mentioned earlier, Josie, we see her ending as well. And for her, it was not a terrible ending.
No, it's definitely not terrible. I mean, it's not good.
No.
But it's not terrible. This was going to be Willie's 50th.
Which, that, like, so dehumanizing to think of her in that way, at least from Willie's perspective.
So, Josie we see as someone who was cared for by Jan. She has her daughter and constantly reflects back onto her daughter wearing that green coat.
Yeah.
And for me, it was definitely a sign of nurturing. It was the same way that
Yes.
Sabina had that hat with the cat ears.
Yep.
So we see a lot of love surrounding Josie's character, even though we see the trauma and the desperation. Because one of the things that drives Josie is the drug addiction.
Yes.
She sees Willie's truck and she's like, I shouldn't go into this. But she is lured by the bag and she feels like she has no other choice.
Right. And all throughout the time that she's with Willie, she keeps thinking, I could leave, I could leave, I could leave.
Right.
And even up to the point where Willie is taking advantage of her, she's counting. And for her, counting is the way for her to leave the situation or to at least blank out her mind.
Right.
And what we see is that this is where the Aswang comes into action.
Right.
The Aswang waits until the last minute, jumps out, scares Willie, and Josie's able to run out and find help along the road.
Right. So this was a part where I was kind of confused. Because, like the Aswang grabbed Willie.
Yes.
And then took a bite out of his arm.
Yes.
And then had to make the decision of what to do next. Like, does she stay and kill Willie? Or does she try to go meet Sabina?
Right. And because I think the Aswang is a she.
Yeah.
I think because the Aswang could only finish one thing, either avenge Marina's death or finish Marina's mission.
Right, but what happens to Willie? So we know what happens to Willie in the long run.
Right.
But does she just leave?
Yes, essentially takes a bite and has to leave because if she keeps going, she's going to end up killing.
But she didn't tie him up or anything.
No.
She just left him?
Well, he's bleeding out, so...
Oh, I guess so. I don't know. I was just thinking, also, if you want someone to bleed out, don't allow that person to go for help. This is Murder 101.
But
tie
also...
him up or something.
Well, so whether or not Willie is tied up, if Willie were to run out for help, he would either A, bleed out, or B, scare someone enough to be like, oh, I think we need help. And if he does go to the hospital, people are going to ask who he is and why he's like this.
True.
And either way, the truth is going to come out because Willie is we can't say that word in this. A dumb butt.
Yeah. Anyways, that was just the point that I was a little confused on. Because, in the story, the Aswang takes a bite. And I was like, the song left. I was like, where's Willie? Why is no one doing anything? It's like, if you're watching a scary movie, it's like, why are you entering that room? Don't leave the killer to just survive.
Fair, but like I said, whether or not Willie stays on the property or leaves, either way, someone's going to figure out something's wrong.
Anyways, the Aswang leaves. This is where Josie's story has slight happy ending. I mean, she gets away.
She gets to the hospital.
Right.
And she's able to tell her story to Constable Sherman.
Right, and also reunite with her mom and daughter.
Yes.
Right. Yep, and this is where Constable Sherman goes and picks up Willie.
Yes.
So the chapter starts off by telling us that Willie does get arrested, and then the rest of the chapter describes how he gets arrested.
Right, because Willie decides to be very braggy about what he's been doing.
Right.
And he's bragging this to a person who's an undercover officer.
Right, so this isn't with Constable Sherman. This is what I think is happening in the cell.
In the cell, yep.
And then, the undercover cop who is also a constable, so I guess he's not a cop. Whatever he is, ends up talking to Willie, and Willie lets it all out.
Yes.
And just tells about the 50 women he's killed, how they're buried. And
the 49 women.
49 women, true. But, so this is where Willie gets arrested, and we get some sense of justice. We did have that story with Corinne in the middle, which was cringing.
That was a reach.
But we do see that side of Willie, and we also know the side of Willie that we read very early on in the book of what traumas led up to him maybe being this character that he is. And then we get the storybook present day Willie of an awful human who is murdering and raping women.
Yeah.
But
he gets arrested.
And I'm sure bad things happen to him in jail. But then we do get one good ending in this book.
One happy ending, yes.
Yes.
In that the Aswang is able to find Sabina, gave Sabina the whole rundown of Alex, where she's been, what's happened to her, where she might be. And she starts this off by giving her the cat ear hat.
Which then Sabina asks Marina to come into the house. I was like, wow, that's so brave.
For real.
Like, you have this girl who does not look great from the story that we're told.
Right.
And you're just like, come on into my house.
I mean, I feel like the Aswang probably had an energy that was like, I'm innocent, I'm trying to do this for you, it's not for me kind of energy.
Yeah. I mean, that could definitely be it, but very brave of Sabina.
I agree. Especially at the time of day this is. This is dark of night.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you, but I also think that the Aswang's determination and insistence was on her side.
That's fair. So this eventually leads to the reunion of Alex and Sabina.
Yes.
I feel like the only heartwarming part of this entire book. And it's them kind of cozied up. They're having a Christmas or holiday celebration.
Yes.
And they even write that it felt like they've been doing this celebration for years.
Yeah.
I was a little scared, honestly, reading it. I was like, something bad's going to happen in this too. But it didn't. It was a very happy ending that brought this horrific journey
to a
nice standstill. Yeah. It was like if you're driving and you watch a bunch of accidents happen right in front of your face and then you just gently stop in the parking lot.
Yes, exactly.
So to go on from there, so this is the end of the story. This is the end of A Tiny Upward Shove. But I think a very good thing to do is continue on by reading the last 2 chapters, I guess.
The next 2 sections. Which are the coda and the author's note.
Right.
And I say this, we both say this, but I say this in particular because when I read the last paragraph, I felt angry. Like, even though I knew that Alex was fine, she had her happy ending with Sabina, the last paragraph, which I will read on page 334 of the hardcover book, kind of made me feel like a little mad. Here is what it says. God let bad happen, but the goddess granted Marina and Willie a miracle of sorts, because somehow what they all got in the end was what they'd hoped for all along, a kind of mercy. And to me, I felt like Marina had no mercy. Like, maybe Willie had mercy in that he got to live.
It might have more been that Marina's mercy came when I think she was in the halfway house. And I think she started to see that her life wasn't really going as planned, and she had suffered so much. And I don't know if she saw an end to suffering. And I feel like, I can't remember the exact words, but I felt like something in there where Marina talked about how difficult the life was, or how, almost like how she didn't maybe want to continue to live that life.
That's fair.
I mean, there are a lot of better happy endings to give Marina.
Yeah.
But I think that was the relief, or the ending that maybe satisfied some of Marina's suffering.
That's fair, because by this point she's been trying, she's been doing all the things that she's told to do, but still without any return.
Right. And even if she gets to a point where all of a sudden she's saved, and let's say Mutya became a millionaire and then picked up Marina, and now they're going to live on a beach house, she still has this drug addiction that she has to deal with. She still has this past of multiple sexual abuses and rapes and things. So her story is so riddled with such
trauma.
it's not saying that someone who has that story can't come out of it, but it's just a very rough life that she's lived. And so maybe this is that relief.
I see.
Yeah. And I think reading just before that quote that you gave is where I actually highlighted in my notes. And same thing, on page 334, what I wrote was, I could see how closely their lives intertwined, how they were both shaped by the same kinds of hurts and disappointments. Even as children, they thought their God allowed bad to happen. I thought that was such an interesting wrapping up to the story. Is that what I deal as the protagonist in Marina and the antagonist in Willie did both have some major traumatic events that led to where they were. And yeah, like there's clearly a bad person in this, but the fact that their lives were so closely intertwined was something I hadn't thought about the whole book. And then when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh. Like big old like moment.
For real.
Yeah. There's one other thing I wanted to highlight, and the reason why I'm trying to get all this out the way is because I feel like the coda and the
author's note.
Yeah, I think that kind of brings the whole story together, so I want to get all the depressing stuff out now.
Absolutely.
I want to know your thoughts on the one scene where Marina's running out and she's going into the LA riots, and she ends up running into someone who is carrying a crossbow. She's on the search for Alex, so she believes that this person is Alex. The person slams her against the wall and starts touching her, but because she thinks it's Alex, she
lets her.
Yeah, and just like is happy to be there.
Right.
But once she finds out that it's not Alex, she ends up finding out that I think they wrote
just a random guy.
I think they even wrote a skinhead. So like maybe someone who's very racist, because the comments that he makes are also very derogatory and racist.
Yeah.
And it's followed by this line. So this is on page 288. On her knees, in an alley, within a world on fire with rage and race wars. An alley between streets where women were being dragged from their cars. Where people were hiding in church basements. Where children were left home alone wondering. Watching their streets go up in flames and yet wanting new sneakers and watches and radios. And more stuff. In an alley with a hot wad of hate-filled spit on her cheeks. She had never in her life been more in need of a change. The imagery behind that was just so wild. I don't know if it's because, we talked about this with Bodega. Like, LA riots were something I've seen and done a little bit of research on.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I saw the background of stores on fire. They even describe it with, like, I don't know, Melissa describes it very well with, like, the Korean owners standing on roofs with guns, people looting, pushing each other out of the way. And then for all that, in my brain, I see this alley where this girl is kneeling and just this hateful thing just happened to her.
Right.
And I just saw that world destroyed. This is like another moment where I'm like, Marina's world was destroyed. Let's say Mutya came in and grabbed her. Maybe that changes the story again. Right. Probably like never gonna happen, but I don't know. Like it was such a big moment in this book for me. Did you have any thoughts as you were reading this part of it?
It felt very... I mean, we keep using this word, but it felt very dark. Like, if this is a moment where I felt like I was in her shoes, and if I were Marina at that point, I would have just laid down in the alley and just waited for death.
Oh, I would have cried. I would
be crying while laying down in that alley, but I wouldn't have like wanted to do anything anymore.
Right, exactly.
I wouldn't have stood up. I wouldn't have tried continuing my mission. I would have felt like it doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter anymore because there's just the whole world is literally and figuratively on fire.
Right. Okay. Let's get to the coda, which is still not great, but it at least provides a sense of where this story came from.
Yes, it sheds more light on the direction of A Tiny Upward Shove, and the coda and the author's note shows that the story in whole was taken from Melissa's journalistic research and findings, specifically acknowledging the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals.
And I think she mentions this in the book at one point, but there's that part of land that goes from, I think it was Seattle or Portland. It's the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
But I think it's called the Trail of Tears because so many women, especially Indigenous women, people get lost there, that it ended up picking up its own nickname. which is awful. I really appreciate that Melissa Chadbourne does spend time on highlighting this, describing that these are truer stories.
And that they're happening, still happening.
And specifically goes to say that this story of Willie Picton is, it's not made up. This character is based on a very true character. She even writes out that the information that they get of the women that Willie murdered is something that you could find on YouTube or something. Yeah. I don't know if I'm ready for that, to be honest.
I was like, I feel like I will never want to
relive this.
Well, no, I would definitely reread the book, maybe not now, maybe in a different time and space, but I don't think I would ever be ready to watch that video without being, I don't know, I feel like I would lose it, either lose it as in cry lose it, or lose it as in anger lose it. Right. But regardless, I don't feel like my heart has the capacity to see that.
Right.
Or hear it.
Right. To be fair, the best part of the coda for me was that she named the women that they know so far have lost their life because
of Willie.
Exactly. And I thought that was so rewarding.
And sad.
Sad for sure, but I think it brings closure to the people that, maybe needed it a little bit. I mean, this is a very long, this has happened in history. Yes. So these names have probably already come out a while ago. But just to lift up their names again and just say, these were the women that were, I think women or people that were affected and hurt by this person.
Yeah. Okay, we know that was a lot. So wherever you're at, let's all take a collective deep breath in. Hold it and release.
And if that didn't help you, I started reading the acknowledgements, and this sentence helped me a lot. So this is Melissa Chadbourne's acknowledgement, and it's the very first one. It's, quote, "To my agent, Ellen Levine, who flags when I've been gratuitous with, quote unquote, all the penises and secretions," end quote. I was like, I just thought of the agent having to read this and be like, because when I read those scenes, I was like, this is disgusting. This is gross, and this is a lot. I can't imagine how much of the actual story was edited out, or how much of the details.
For real.
Anyways, that brought me a little bit of joy as I ended this heavy note, and I was like, I don't know. There's a lot. So what did you think about the story?
I felt that it was well written. It was definitely a story that needed to be told, a story that needed to be read. So much trauma is in the book that I think for those who haven't read it yet, they need to be in a place that's ready for it. Because diving in without any preconceived notions kind of shook me many times.
Right. I didn't think about it that way, but I agree. This was a story that I think needed to be told, and was told in a very great way, both from the aspect of what sexual abuse and all that stuff can look like, but also genuinely from this last read, how someone's life can be affected by homelessness, and maybe not always the other way around, where homelessness affects somebody.
Right.
For me, it started off really slow. The first read, I kind of just sat there and was like, okay, let's see where this goes. There's a lot of stuff going on. I don't know what's happening. As we got to about the middle, that's when I started seeing everything starting to click, and I got way more excited about each read. The last read that we just did, I was hooked, and I was like, where is this going? How are we closing off all these threads? And she did such a good job of finishing off all the stories and the loose ends. And like I said, Mutya's story was really good. And even in Mutya's story, we had that scene where Marina comes back in her dream, just like Lola came back in Marina's dream. It was like, oh, that was so well done. Totally.
I agree in that there was a lot happening at the beginning, and it was hard to figure out what was going on. But separately, I feel like most of the chapters were long.
Yeah.
And that's what made it hard for me to speed through. And that's why at the end, similar to your experience, I was able to dash through it, because a lot of the chapters were on the shorter end.
Right. So, we've made it through this book.
Yes.
I genuinely did like this book.
Yes.
I do recommend it, but it does come with that caveat, like Jamae said. Understand that this story has a lot of darkness to it. I would not recommend going into it thinking it's a light book.
No.
Once you do that, the story in itself is very good with a well-written and thought-out point of view.
Yes, absolutely.
But, like I said, I get the next pick.
Yeah!
We're hopefully going lighter. I actually don't know the whole story of this book, but I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'm going to tell you through the hint of jam. Okay, so 3 hints. First is it's a more lighthearted read. Second, this is the author's first novel. And third, it's a New York Times Editor's Choice book, as well as an NPR Best Book of 2022. Now, I'm going to give you 3 choices.
Okay.
The 3 choices are, first, Disoriented by Elaine Shea Chu. I may have said that middle name wrong, and I'm so sorry if I did. Second, Severance by Ling Ma. Third, What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. What do you pick?
Well, first of all, what I know about these books, most of them are not lighthearted. So I feel like that first hint is not helpful. The author's first novel hint is more helpful because I know one of these is not a first novel. And I know one of these is also not a novel, but a nonfiction book. So I'm not sure if the third hint is helpful, but I think that my choice, or your choice, and my answer is Disoriented by Elaine Shea Chu.
Yes. Disorientation. Sorry, I wrote it wrong. Disorientation. Okay, so the amount that I read, I heard it was somewhat lighthearted, even though it deals around a heavier subject, which is identification.
Exactly.
But let's talk about the author.
Okay.
So, Elaine Shea Chu, once again, I'm so sorry if I said that wrong, but she's a Taiwanese-American writer from California. She's a former Rona Jaff Graduate Fellow, also might have said Jaff wrong, at NYU and NYFA Artist Fellow. She's also the recipient of the 2023 Fred R. Brown Literary Award. The back cover of the book gives us a little bit more insight on what we're going to read, so let me give that to you. A Taiwanese-American woman's coming of consciousness ignites eye-opening revelations and chaos on a college campus in this outrageously hilarious and startling tender debut novel. 29-year-old PhD student Ingrid Yang is desperate to finish her dissertation on the late canonical poet Xiao Wen Chu and never read about quote-unquote Chinesey things again. But after years of grueling research, all she has to show for her efforts are junk food addiction and stomach pain. When she accidentally stumbles upon a curious note in the Chu archives one afternoon, she convinces herself it's her ticket out of the academic hell. But Ingrid's in much deeper than she thinks. Her clumsy exploits to unravel the note's message lead to an explosive discovery, upending not only her sheltered life within academia, but her entire world beyond it. With her trusty friend Eunice Kim by her side and her rival Vivian Vo hot on her tail, together they set off on a roller coaster of mishaps and misadventures, from book burnings and OTC drug hallucinations to hot button protests and Yellow Peril 2.0 propaganda. In the aftermath, nothing looks the same to Ingrid, including her gentle, doting fiancé Stephen Green when he embarks on a book tour with the super kawaii Japanese author he's translated. Doubts and insecurities creep in for the first time. As the events Ingrid instigated keep spiraling, she'll have to confront her sticky relationship to white men and white institutions, and most of all, herself.
Wow.
Yes. I'm excited.
I'm excited too, but it doesn't sound very light, like I said earlier.
Okay, maybe light's not the word. It sounds fun.
Definitely sounds like an adventure.
Yeah. For people that are going to follow along with us, what pages are we reading next?
For this first read, we're reading pages 3 through 82 for those who are following along on the hardcover. And for everyone, that's the first part Fall Quarter, chapters 1 through 5, which are titled The Curious Note to the Versatility of Tampons.
Right. So, if you're excited to go into our next read, you have other suggestions that you can also pop up, lighter reads, how can people reach us?
Y'all can reach us through email at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com, or you can comment on our posts at Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
We also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, which also has our bookshop that shows the books that we've read and other books that we recommend. Otherwise, after reading all this, I truly hope that y'all can be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat.
Bye.
Bye.